Hey everyone, it's Chelsea from the Allen County Public Library, and for this week's Adult Summer Reading Program, we will be discussing the Grimm side of Grimm fairy tales. Now, the things that we will be discussing will be a little gruesome of nature, so if you don't like that sort of thing, or if you have children, you might want to stop this video now. But if you're still with me, let's go ahead and get started. So many of you are probably familiar with fairy tales, and you might have heard of the Grimm brothers, but even if you aren't familiar with them, you're probably familiar with their work because of Disney animated movies like Cinderella and Snow White. The Grimm brothers, William and Jacob, were born in Germany in the late 1700s. They grew up to be lawyers, but their true passion was preserving German language and folk stories. They set out on the mission to preserve the German folk stories in a period of time called German Romanticism, and that is where German culture was promoted. So they were set out to preserve these stories that the German people told, but the stories weren't strictly German of nature, even though they were promoted as such. These stories, a lot of them are found in cultures all over the world, but nonetheless, they collected these stories and created a book that we now know as the Grimm Brothers Fairy Tales. In the first edition, there were 86 stories, and unfortunately for the brothers, it wasn't all that successful. And that was largely due to the stories being geared towards adults, and they were pretty gruesome. They weren't the happy stories that we know of today. They had themes such as cannibalism and mutilation and evil stepfamilies. But they changed those stories over time. They geared them towards children, and over time, over their lifetime, those stories became hugely popular. One of the most popular Grimm fairy tales is Cinderella, and we know it today based on the Disney version of the story. And in that story, Cinderella has an awful stepmother and stepsisters that just treat her terribly, but with the help of her furry friends and a fairy godmother, she gets to go to the ball, meet the prince, he falls in love with her, tracks her down with the glass slipper, and they live happily ever after. But in the Grimm version of this story, it's a little different. Yes, she has the terrible stepmother and stepsisters, but when the prince tries to track her down with a shoe, he comes to the stepsisters and he's trying to see if they are the princess that he's looking for. So the stepmother tells them, take this knife and cut off part of your foot to make sure it fits in that shoe. So one sister cuts off a toe and the other sister cuts off the back of her heel so that they fit into that shoe. And the prince would have believed that this was his princess if it wasn't for Cinderella's magic little bird that goes to the prince and says, hey, check her shoe. So he looks and he's like, this can't be my princess. So he tracks down Cinderella finally. She puts on the shoe. He realizes that's his true love, and they live happily ever after. But in some versions of this story, that doesn't end there. At their wedding, the bird goes and plucks the eyes out of the stepsisters. So I guess the moral of the story is justice will prevail. Another Grimm fairy tale that you're probably familiar with is Snow White. In the Disney version of this story, Snow White is the stepdaughter of the queen, and she's so beautiful, and the queen is so jealous that she runs off into the woods to live with the 7 dwarfs. And the queen tracks her down, gives her a poison apple, where she falls into a sleeping state until she's awoke by true love's first kiss. And she lives happily ever after with the prince. But in the Grimm version, it's not so happy. When Snow White is just 7 years old, the queen's magic mirror tells her that she's no longer the most beautiful woman in the land. And she's so angry by this, she calls in a huntsman and she's like, take my 7-year-old stepdaughter out into the woods and kill her. Bring her back in just her lungs and her liver. Why that? I have no idea. But when the huntsman gets out there, He can't do it. She pleads for her life, and he says she's so beautiful. I can't do this. She'll get eaten alive out here anyway, so he lets her go. But in the woods, she finds the 7 dwarves, and she lives there. But the queen knows, because of her mirror, that Snow White is not dead. So she tries and she tries and she tries to get her killed. She finally thinks that she succeeds by giving her the poison apple. But the dwarves keep her in a glass coffin because she never seems to decay. So they keep her there, and the prince finds her out in their cottage, and he's so entranced by her beauty. And he's so happy when he looks on her. He's like, I must have her. So he takes her with him everywhere he goes. And his servants are like, gosh, I'm tired of carrying this lady around all the time. And in doing so, they kind of jostle her body, and the apple becomes dislodged from her throat. And she comes back to life. They get married. And at the wedding, the stepmother, the queen, comes to the wedding just to see, and she has to put on these scalding hot iron shoes, and she dances herself to death. The end. So there are over 200 fairy tales in the final edition of the Grimm's fairy tales. And one of the most gruesome stories in that collection is decidedly the Juniper Tree. And that goes a little something like this. So there once was this couple, and they longed to have a child. One day, the wife goes down under a juniper tree in their front yard, and she wishes for this child. And she suddenly feels so light and so happy, and 9 months later, she has a son. And she's so happy to have had this child that she dies. The father later remarries, and him and his new wife have a child, and it's a daughter. And the wife loves this daughter so much, but she starts to just really resent and hate the other son. And she does this because the son will take the inheritance away from her daughter. But she just gets so angry with him that she starts to be abusive to him, and she just makes every second of his day miserable. So one day, it says that she becomes possessed by the devil, and she has the son come in, and she's like, do you want an apple? And he says, sure, I want an apple. So she says, well, go and get it out of the bin. So he goes to the bin, and he reaches down to get it out of it, and while he's down there getting an apple, she slams the lid down on him, and he loses his head. Now, she does end up having a little bit of remorse for her actions, but she ends up making her daughter, who she says that she loves, feel responsible for her brother's death. So in an effort to cover up her crime, she says, we'll feed it to the father. So she feeds the father his own son, and the daughter takes the scraps of the boy and buries him under the tree with his mother. And when she does so, a bird comes out of the tree, and the bird goes into town, and it tells what happened to the boy with this beautiful song. And the people of the town say it's just so beautiful, and they give gifts to the bird so that it'll keep singing. So the bird collects a gold necklace, some shoes, and a millstone. He goes back to the house, and meanwhile, while the bird's doing this, the mother is just so guilt-ridden with what she's done. She just knows that death is coming to her. So while she's inside, the bird comes out, and he starts to sing the song. And the father's like, that's such a beautiful song. And he goes outside, and the bird gives him that gold necklace. And he comes back in, and he's like, look what this bird gave me. Isn't it beautiful? And the daughter goes outside to see what the bird has for her. And it gives her the shoes. And she comes inside, and the mother just feels so awful. She's like, well, maybe if I go outside, I'll feel better. So she goes outside, and immediately the bird drops the millstone on the mother, and she dies. So the father and daughter hear what goes on. They go outside. The mother's missing, but where they stand, they see their son and brother. He's back alive. So I guess that's a little bit of a happy ending. Not for the stepmother, though. But some of the fairy tales have a moral to them, and they seem to have a theme of good overcoming evil and justice will prevail, but some of the stories just do not have a moral to them at all, other than bad things sometimes happen. But through the years, Grimm fairy tales have been popular, and not only the Grimm's fairy tales, but fairy tales all over the world still have stood the test of time and are part of our culture even today. So for this video, I hope you've enjoyed it. I got a lot of the information that I've used today from a podcast called Stuff You Should Know. There are episodes on fairy tales if you want to check those out. And I also got information from the Grimm fairy tales themselves. And we have a hard copy of that available at the library, or you can look at our ebooks that we have of those available on our catalog. So just do a quick search for that and you can find that. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned a little something about the Grimm fairy tales, and maybe there's a fairy tale that you love that you'd like to share a little bit about that with us. So just put that in the comments below. We'd love to read your stories or the stories that you like, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.